Hello everyone, my name is Tomas Diaz and I am here to talk about pesticides and environmental justice. I am the Healthy People and Communities Program Manager at the Northwest Center for Alternatives to Pesticides, or NCAP, where we promote safe and less toxic alternatives to chemical pesticides for the protection of our communities and our environment. At NCAP, we are a small, local, female-led organization that strives to protect our communities, our soil, our water from the contamination and the damage that these pesticides might cause. So join us and let's get into it. To begin to understand how agrochemicals damage our environment, we first need to understand where they come from and what they are. So the law defines pesticides as, quote, any substance or mixture of substances intended for preventing, destroying, repelling, or mitigating any pest, unquote. Insecticides, herbicides, fungicides, bactericides, and rodenticides are all included in this category. And while most people think of pesticides as a chemical compound designed in a factory, the term can also refer to chemical agents like bacteria or virus or fungus, and management practices that aim to heal an unstable ecosystem. But it is often underestimated how nature is in reality the most effective pest controller. And we used to know about this. Ancient indigenous and local peoples have acquired this knowledge by living in direct contact with the environment for thousands of years. Much of this knowledge has been lost through centuries of colonialism, which brought a shift from the holistic ideologies of coexistence and balance with nature to one that valued capital wealth, expansion, and indiscriminate consumption. The Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, defines social justice as, quote, the fair treatment and meaningful involvement of all people, regardless of race, color, national origin, or income, with respect to the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, and policies. This means that environmental justice really encompasses social justice. Let's look at history a little bit. From its first recorded appearances in Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago, pesticide use has changed and now become a household item in the Western world. Herbicides, insecticides are so prevalent in today's food system that it's easy to forget that chemical pesticides were not originally intended for agricultural use. During World War I, early chemical fumigants were used as a tactic to force the enemies out of the trenches. These chemicals would later be repurposed to combat soil-borne pests. Later, during World War II, dichlorodiphenyl trichloroethane, or DDT, was used to protect soldiers from the threat of typhus and malaria abroad. It was then thought of as a great contribution to the health of the world, sprinkled in sleeping bags and dropped from planes. It was after the war that pesticides made their way into the American household and agriculture. By that time, structures of racism and class discrimination had already been long established in the USA through the systematic oppression and exclusion of BIPOC communities and people of lower socioeconomic status. This had resulted in substantial inequalities in exposure to pollutants, leaving those communities vulnerable and exposed. This is confirmed by a new study that found that people of color and low-income communities are at disproportionate risk of pesticide exposure. It was conducted by the Center for Biological Diversity. Researchers from historically black colleges and collaborators from farm worker, racial justice, and conservation groups. The research reviewed CDC and EPA data along with existing pesticide research and found that structural injustices Weak regulations and precarious farm worker protections have led to disproportionate exposure to pesticides among people of color. Robert Bullard, a co-author of the report and the director of the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice at Texas Southern University, says that this is because, quote, these workers somehow are seen as expendable, unquote. He adds that, quote, this study shows the systematic neglect that led to a whole workforce being an underclass and not giving the same weight when it comes to health and safety, unquote. Today, practically 90% of pesticide use goes to agriculture, which means that farm workers are most exposed of all to these pollutants and their deadly effects in our health and our environment. Nationally, 83% of this community identifies as Hispanic or Latine. And this community is one that we, as an organization, work very closely with. Because social justice is environmental justice, it is critical to understand the role pesticides play in violence and systemic racism. Up next, we will look at examples of pesticide policy that has effectively protected those in positions of power and privilege at the expense of non-white communities and those living in poverty. The Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, or FIFRA, is the federal statute that governs the registration, distribution, sale, and use of pesticides in the United States. Each year, the United States uses over 1 billion pounds of pesticides, nearly a fifth of worldwide use. In 2017 and 2018, the Environmental Protection Agency, or EPA, approved more than 100 pesticides containing ingredients widely considered to be dangerous. Once approved, pesticides often remain on the market for decades, even when scientific evidence overwhelmingly shows a pesticide is causing harm to people or the environment. Let's start with the Food Quality Protection Act, or FQPA, the EPA's standard for regulating pesticides with a health-based approach. This legislation, signed into law in 1996, amended the older FIFRA to carry out more accurate pesticide risk assessments. A chemical would only be approved if it had, quote, reasonable certainty of no harm, unquote. However, there is a catch. Assessments must, quote, consider aggregate risk from exposure to a pesticide from multiple sources: food, water, residential, and other non-occupational sources, unquote. So this means that occupational sources of exposure are excluded, including those to farm workers. There are about 2.5 million farm workers in the United States, and about 73% of them were born outside of the United States. The exclusion of agricultural workers from Fair Labor Act policies that protect employees is actually rooted in slavery. Exclusion from policies like overtime, minimum wage, and sick leave was widely interpreted as an effort to keep black people out of the perks and protections that most whites enjoyed. It made the loss of free slave labor, a little easier on farm owners. Despite its racial beginnings, the exclusion of agricultural and domestic workers is still in practice today. Another good example is the Clean Water Act. This legislation requires the amount of water pollutants at a certain level for good drinking, recreating, and fishing conditions. Indigenous people of the Northwest have a diet heavy on water critters, far heavier than other people in the region. However, when determining the fish consumption rate, Washington's Department of Ecology set it at less than a serving per month. This leaves these tribes vulnerable to high levels of pollutants based on their fish and shellfish consumption. Michael Graham, executive director of the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, claims that, quote, this type of environmental policymaking, which provides less protection for a population of people and subsequently leads to the unequal exposure of pollutants, is undoubtedly an environmental injustice, unquote. The Worker Protection Standard, or WPS, is an EPA law designed to protect workers from pesticide poisoning and injury. It aims to reduce pesticide exposures for workers and their families. It applies to farm workers and those that work in a forest, nursery, or greenhouse that produces agricultural plants. It began in 1995 and was expanded in 2015. The WPS protects workers by requiring people stay out of treated areas during and after an application, proper protective gear for applicators, access to supplies for routine and emergency washing, annual safety training to reduce take-home residues, access to information about pesticides used on-site, age limits for applicators, employers to keep records of all pesticide applications and protections from retaliation and discrimination. This is still a work in progress. Many advocacy groups across the country are actively working to improve protections and hold the EPA accountable for not ensuring better compliance at the state level. Workers continue to be poisoned needlessly. The past few years have seen record temperatures and droughts. Specifically in the Northwest, temperatures have risen 2 degrees in the past century. Higher temperatures affect the balance in the environment and natural systems, leading to more outbreaks and pests. These imply the use of even more pesticides, further contaminating our soils, water, air, and communities. Pesticides affect climate change through their manufacturing, transportation, and application. 3 major contaminants are released in the making of pesticides: carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. In Idaho, for instance, 17,000 acres of land have been heavily disturbed due to phosphate ore mining, including land with significant cultural importance to the Shoshone-Bannock and Northern Paiute people. This resource is mined, refined, and produced into glyphosate, the active ingredient in the popular weed killer Roundup. Phosphate mining harms the environment by polluting the air and the water and destroying wildlife habitat. Waterways have also presented higher temperatures, which has been found to be detrimental for the health of aquatic ecosystems. Research observed that in warmer waters, the harmful effects of pesticides worsened for fish and other critters. For instance, for bluegill and rainbow trout, the toxicity of glyphosate doubled in warmer water. In farms, to protect their crops from increasing numbers of insects, farmers are using seeds coated with pesticides such as neonicotinoids as a control method. The neonicotinoids are responsible for a 40% decline of insects, including pollinators, who are enormously vital for our systems. The list of negative impacts of prolonged pesticide use in the environment keeps growing. The current rate at which we destroy our soil is unsustainable, and according to experts, within 50 years, there will be a serious risk and threat to public health. Our excessive reliance on agrochemicals to support our fragile monoculture industry is weakening our land, and eventually there won't be enough fertile soil to support our demand. Weaker soil also means weaker crops. Food is becoming progressively less nutritious and lacks important minerals, not to mention be covered in pesticides. Nearly 70% of food crops in the US present traces of agrochemicals, which accumulate in the body, potentially leading to serious illnesses. As we all know, pesticides leak into the environment and our communities. After applied, these substances may drift closer to habitated spaces and stick to workers' clothes and bodies, as well as making their way into our soil and water. Exposure to pesticides may occur through occupational exposure of workers. When farm workers prepare, transport, and apply pesticides, they are considered to be the most vulnerable to these hazardous chemicals. That is, at the highest risk of suffering acute intoxications. However, irrespective of whether the occupation involves the use of pesticides, the presence of chemical residues in the working environment constitutes potential occupational exposure. Workers who mix, load, transport, and apply formulated pesticides are normally considered to be the group that will receive the greatest exposure because of the nature of their work and are therefore at the highest risk for possible acute intoxications. In some situations, exposure to pesticides can occur from accidental spills of chemicals, leakages, or faulty spraying equipment. The exposure of workers increases in the case of not paying attention to the instructions on how to use the pesticides, and particularly when they ignore basic safety guidelines on the use of personal protective equipment or fundamental sanitation practices, such as washing hands after pesticide handling or before eating. Some effects of pesticide exposure on the human body include allergic reactions, headaches, dizziness, and hypersensitivities, among others. Longer exposure can lead to long-term effects like cancer, reproductive disorders, damage to nervous system, and other serious illnesses. Many communities more at risk for pesticide exposure also face other social, political, and environmental stressors. The Center for the Health Assessment of Mothers and Children of Salinas, or Chamacos study, is the longest-running longitudinal birth cohort study of pesticides and other environmental exposures among children in a farm worker community. Chamacos means little children in Mexican Spanish, which reflects the population served. Starting in 1999, researchers enrolled pregnant women living in California's Salinas Valley, one of the most productive agricultural regions in the nation. They have followed these families for 19 years, measuring exposures to pesticides and other chemicals and assessing children's growth, health, and development every 1 to 2 years. In 2010 and 2011, they expanded this study by enrolling additional 9-year-old children into the cohort. More than 600 children continue to participate in the study and will be followed until adulthood. The Chamaco study has spearheaded almost 150 publications, shedding light on critical environmental exposures and health. Researchers found that women who had higher exposure to organophosphates during pregnancy were more likely to have children with neurodevelopmental disorders. This could mean infants with slower reflexes, toddlers who show autism-like disorders, 5-year-olds with behavioral problems like ADHD, and 7-year-olds whose IQs, on average, are 7 points behind their peers. Similar results were found in Chamaco's sister studies, one based in Columbia University and the other at Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, both in New York. At the rate at which we are destroying and consuming our resources, the landscape for human societies looks pretty bleak. Change is inevitable if we want to have a planet to live on and feed from. It does appear overwhelming to think how much change needs to happen, but the best way is to take it one step at a time. We have to work together towards a more sustainable, circular agricultural economy. Climate-resilient farming is a vital part of the solution. achieved by supporting organic practices, many of which are rooted in indigenous and black knowledge. Many small farms are partnering up to conserve their resources through regenerative agriculture. Different sustainable practices like no-till and cover cropping control the excessive release of carbon dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and methane. They also help in the conversion of carbon dioxide into oxygen and rebuild the soil health. These practices apply as well to your home and garden. Controlling your pests or weeds through natural means is possible and recommended. Techniques include increasing the number of beneficial insects that prey on pests, flame weeding, mulching, mechanical and manual weed removal, and looking for the least hazardous insecticides. In the household, sustainable practices are shared among community members and local organizations. Food waste can be recycled and reused as growing material, reducing the amount of trash generated. Local organic foods can be found in farmers markets, farm stands, and community-supported agriculture, or CSA. This and much more needs to be done in order to achieve a sustainable food system, environment, and lifestyle. We need to empower our communities by supporting our local organic food producers, shorten the food chain, and know exactly where your meal comes from. Growing pesticide-free gardens that collect rainwater, are havens for pollinators, or grow food crops are valid and much needed forms of environmental justice. Also, and very important, choosing the right people to represent you. If you like what we talked about today or have any more questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at www.pesticide.org or any of our available channels of communication.